For the past 50 years, companies have been on a mission to achieve growth by cutting costs. And to a large extent, globalization has been both an enabler and a result of this mission. Maybe the most visible example for this is the creation of an extended just-in-time supply chain that wraps itself around the world. Thomas Friedman from the New York Times was right when he praised the global supply chain as one of the wonders of the modern world. Globalization going into reverse started a few years ago. One trigger was the trade war between the United States and China, another the COVID pandemic, and now we have the conflict in Ukraine. Business leaders I talk to have no expectation that we will get back to a kind of pre-crisis normal anytime soon, if ever. Nor can we yet talk about a new normal, a phase of consistent, predictable economic activity. Normal appears to be over. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in a workshop for a client in Singapore. And there I had the privilege to listen to my colleague Elton Parker talking about supply chain resilience. And I found Elton's points absolutely fascinating. So it is a great pleasure to have Elton on the channel today. Elton Parker, you're the global leader of wargaming and simulations at BCG, and you are based in Washington, D.C. And you have a very unusual background for a consultant. Can you talk about yourself a bit?
Yes, hi Christian, thank you. Pleasure to be with you here today, and thank you for inviting me to talk through a couple subjects that obviously are near and dear to our hearts and ones we enjoy helping our clients think through. But to my background, yes, it's not the typical consulting one. I didn't come right off campus or join from an MBA program or something similar. I spent the first 23-ish years of my professional life as a naval aviator, flying aircraft off the carriers across the globe and getting to see different countries and people and nationalities and how they think about things. The last 7 or 8 years or so in uniform, I also got to serve on senior staff. So the principal strategic advisor to our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to the commander of U.S. Southern Command, and then ultimately the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And in those capacities, I got to think with, be with, learn from, experience with senior leaders across the military and civilian domains, public, private sector, foreign and domestic, and really see how different strategic leaders looked at challenge, looked at opportunities, looked at disruption, looked at the things that are impactful, and not just reacting to them, but are there options they can shape. So that was how I really formulated my strategic thinking skills, if you will. I then ended my time in uniform by being on the staff and faculty at our National Defense University here in the DC area. And so as helping teach courses in strategic planning and foresight and over the horizon strategic thinking and future of diplomacy and things like that, it continued to hone that skill. And I learn from every interaction I have, and that's the beauty of continuing to be adjunct faculty to this day, getting to guest lecture for the Defense Department or at the State Department or at civilian universities here in the DC area. So when that came to an end, I was fortunate enough to join for the first time the consulting world, and I helped lead and build the risk and crisis management practice at another large consulting firm. And again, building on anticipating and strategic risk and scenario planning and looking at different disruptions and challenges and opportunities. So with all that, then ultimately came the opportunity to work at BCG, and that's where I got to join you and meet some of the amazing colleagues here. So that's just a brief background on how I came.
Very impressive, and I still can't believe I'm working with someone who was a Top Gun. Moving on to the topic of resilience, one could say that navigating uncertainty and anticipating disruption has always been critical for top management. What has changed?
Well, it's a great question, Christian. It's not so much that new things have happened, it's that things are happening in new ways. And by that I mean the sources of uncertainty and disruption are roughly still the same sources. It's people. it's processes, it's technology, it's nature, it's regulations, it's any of number of things. But I think perhaps what's changing is maybe the speed and the convergence that all these disruptions might be happening. For example, it's not just the most active storm season in the U.S. on record in 2020, all the way through one language's alphabet, halfway through a second language's alphabet when naming storms. It's not just the tens of millions of acres of wildfire destruction across 3 continents. It's not just the most active set of social unrest and political upheaval across multiple continents. It's not just the largest peacetime government mobilization in history in the U.S., with the stand-up and stand-down of over 450,000 new government employees for the conduct of the 2020 decennial census. We had to throw a global pandemic on top of that just for good measure. And so it's not just any one disruption, and it's not just a series of them, in series. It's the duration, and it's the convergence, and the near simultaneity. And again, it's the fatigue of all this, that you can't just plan for one thing, wait for it to be over, and then it's blue skies. So it's, in the military, there's a term called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think that kind of describes it. It's not just, where is the price of oil per barrel? Is it 80? Is it 40? Is it 110? Is it above all U.S. dollars? But it's the speed with which it might be moving from 110 to 80 to 40 and back and forth. So that's the volatility. And it's the number of factors that are acting on it. So that's kind of the complexity. And then the ambiguity comes in, the actors, their motivations, the time it might be here, the second and third order effects of the disruption. So it's a lot of, you'll hear the term wicked problem thrown out, and that's very much what, instead of it being one every 10 or one every 5 years, it seems like it's one every other week at times. And so it's the speed of onset, the speed of contagion, quite literally sometimes, as we've seen. So it's the amount of uncertainty, that's the maelstrom that's swirling around, that catches people off guard and makes it seem like, wow, I can't do anything. I can't predict, certainly. And so all I'm stuck with is planning for most likely or most dangerous. And instead, what we try to help people see is that sometimes taking an action removes a lot of the uncertainty around it. You start to control some things, and then also start to prioritize. And instead of constantly fighting off the wolf closest to the sled, maybe you start being able to think, why am I sledding through wolf country in the first place? And so you start to take a little bit of a strategic lens. And then ideally what we try to get to, as you know, is things like anticipating surprise, embracing risk. Therefore, we can harness uncertainty. So it's not trying to predict, it's not trying to react when we have a plan or a disruption, but it's anticipating it. Are there warnings? Are there early warnings and indicators and signals and signposts that a risk is about to materialize? And might there be some options I can do today to shape it? Maybe accelerate an advantageous scenario, as well as the more traditional buy down, avoid, mitigate, transfer the disadvantageous one. So that's kind of what's changed, is the volatility and the uncertainty and the complexity and the ambiguity, the speed which all that happens, but then also some of the mindset shift on, are there ways that we can think about this differently and take some more proactive, risk-intelligent decisions? So hopefully that's a little bit.
Elton, from your perspective, when you are talking to business leaders, what are your key messages about risk and planning under uncertainty?
Thanks, Christian. In many of our conversations, as you've mentioned, some that we've had together, it's getting in the mindset of some of those executives and understanding how they view risk, how they think about disruption. And it's quite understandable. I mean, risk is literally and figuratively a 4-letter word, but it's also a two-sided coin. Challenge on one side, which is everybody's familiar with, and opportunity on the other, which is sometimes juxtaposed in phrases like risk and opportunity, or risk versus reward, or things like that. It's two sides of the same coin. And when you start to see that risk, by definition, is either a positive or a negative impact to one or more objectives, you start to see that, wow, are there not just advantageous scenarios where I wait for it to happen and I benefit, but are there steps I can take today to accelerate that advantageous scenario materializing? The usual progression is risk to issue to incident to crisis to catastrophe, et cetera. And all of those sound negative, and that's the way risk is usually viewed. And so it's housed in compliance, and things like internal controls and internal audit usually are the measures placed against it. But if you move risk closer towards strategy, particularly strategic risk, and if you elevate the role of the chief risk officer as well as the chief strategy officer, and you bring them together as an incredibly powerful duo, you start to see that risk powers performance and risk informs strategy. And it's achieving what we try to call risk intelligence. And it doesn't mean, an IQ per se. It just means, are you more aware of the positive side of risk? Are you more aware of the early warnings and indicators, the signals, the signposts that might be sitting right in front of you, but you're focused in another area because you're thinking about the detrimental effect, understandably, and compliance and other things. But from the strategic side, is there a first mover advantage? Is there an advantage to be gained by getting to the regulator first, or getting something in place before there's a regulation against it, or forming a new partnership, or betting on that leap ahead in technology and on the emergent one? That's the mindset that kind of shifts, one from defensive, reactive, protective, value protection focused. Understandable and absolutely a must, don't get me wrong. But the shift sometimes comes in getting people, the senior leaders and their enterprise leadership team and boards, et cetera, to think about, where might I be able to take some calculated risk? Focus on value creation, not just the value protection. Can I take a step today that affects the market around me? Instead of ceding the initiative to the disruption and reacting, can I seize the initiative and make the market, the payer, the provider, the consumer, the regulator, anybody in that marketplace react to me? That's when we see that shift start to take place, and people start to be a little bit more risk aggressive and think about, wow, here is, if I make the move here, there's the value. If I wait, maybe a little bit less risk, but also a little bit less on the potential payout. Maybe a little bit more focused on value creation, less on value, or focused on value protection, less on value creation. So there's always that trade-off, but at least getting people to see that there's two sides to that coin, and elevating risk to be part of the strategic risk conversation. I think that's one of the shifts that we start to see more and more often as we have those conversations with some of our senior leaders.
Elton, in the workshop in Singapore, you were using terms that really resonated with the audience. If I remember correctly, these were signal advantage, decisive move advantage, and resilience advantage. Could you explain this?
Absolutely. And one thing I forgot to mention early on is the area that I work here in BCG. It's a topic area called uncertainty advantage. And my wife says, if anybody can find an advantage out of uncertainty, somehow it's you. So I took that as a positive. Please don't burst my bubble. But within that, just like the name implies, is we seek to, as I said earlier, through anticipating surprise and embracing risk, seeing both sides of the coin, we get to harness uncertainty. And usually while everybody else has got their head down and thinking about the reactive and defensive and protective measures, again, all needed, there are opportunities to gain or maintain a competitive advantage. And as you outlined, the three areas that we talk about are signal advantage. So can I detect the signal from all the noise better? Are my ears or my sensors attenuated in a better way to detect that weak signal before it's obvious to everybody? Can I have sensors in new places? Can I get more pieces of data that start to build what we call a common operating picture? Instead of random pieces of data, you start to contextualize it and make it information. The next step then is what we call that decisive move advantage. And it's taking that contextualized information and now turning it into actionable intelligence. And that's what you need to make an informed decision, a risk intelligent informed decision. So not just I'm doing this, but when am I doing it? What triggers am I waiting for to be able to make that decision? What am I anticipating will be the intended and unintended consequences of that decision? And have I thought through Okay, if it changes, here's my key performance indicator as well as key risk indicator that all go into that decision point. So it's not just, hey, when I get to the fork in the road, I turn right. But how far in advance of that fork in the road do I know to start slowing down? And have I started looking for pieces of information that the bridge might be out if I go right, even though it's the shorter route, maybe I should take the left because I've thought through it. Or I've asked other people who have already journeyed down the road and they can radio back some of their thinking. And so it's enabling that timely, proactive decision and understanding the consequences. And when you combine signal advantage with decisive move advantage, you end up with what we call resilience advantage. And that's, in the simplest terms, it's when the storm hits and everybody's head is down and you're hunkered down and you're protecting. Do you have the ability to have your head up, waiting for that first glimpse of blue sky, or that you actually are pre-positioned so the storm doesn't impact you as much? You're in another area already gaining a step ahead. So you're not just surviving the disruption, but you're able to thrive on it. And that little incremental market gain is huge, because over time you start to build those up and you're able to accelerate through some of these disruptions. Again, while everybody pauses or waits for the storm to pass, you might be already accelerating through it, enjoying the benefits of the blue sky on the other side, as well as looking to the horizon for the next, starting the cycle with signal advantage again. When's the storm clouds start brewing? What are the early warning signals? What do we start thinking about and shaping for? Or if you're a business that might sell generators or water or storm drains or roof repairs or something, you're already positioned again to gain some competitive advantage from that storm occurring. So it's all about matching up the signal advantage with decisive move to help produce that resilience advantage. Hope that helps.
Elton, before I let you go, I would like you to elaborate about the risk appetite of an organization and how companies can use the current uncertainty to achieve a competitive advantage.
That's a great segue from the last topic there. Is when you make those decisions, it's based on what we call a risk appetite. So how willing are you to potentially put some capital in the game? So to give up a little bit of value protection focused to gain some value creation. And it's not just across all, every potential disruption in every situation, but as an organization, as a culture, as an enterprise, do you have a zero defect mentality? Do you embrace, like several of my bosses taught me in the military, to test, fail fast, learn faster. And so they encouraged taking risk, calculated risk, but doing so because you've thought through the intended and unintended consequences, and you've war gamed things, and you've red teamed things, and you've done the contingency planning of not just if it happens, that's the probability aspect, but let's give everything a 1.0 probability and then say, when it happens, are we as prepared as we think we are? Are we as prepared as we need to be? Then you can start saying, okay, now do I understand the impact? Do I have blind spots where I think I'm covered and I'm good to go on this? Have I thought through, wow, when this takes place, my house of cards falls. If I miss this opportunity, wow, if I look backwards, could I have seen it coming? And that's kind of the use of what we call futures, histories, or pre-mortems. It's envisioning ultimate outcomes and then looking back to say, these were not barriers going forward. They were decision points. They were implementation considerations that now I look back, I'm like, they're obvious to me. If I'd only had the risk appetite to be able to take a decisive move with maybe less than a pristine situation awareness. I don't see the entire picture perfectly, but I have enough to be able to say that I could do this or hold off here, form this new partnership, invest in this leap ahead in technology. And that's where my experience with tabletop exercises and simulations and scenario planning and practicing and rehearsing. Every single emergency that I ever had in the cockpit, and there were a number of them, I'd had tenfold, if not more, in the simulator because I had tested and rehearsed and practiced, and I'd made tons of mistakes. And I think we learn better from the mistakes sometimes than we do from the success, because you'd have to replicate everything to achieve that same thing. But on mistakes, you know exactly this was where it went wrong, and so I know exactly what not to do next time. And so again, that mindset of test, fail fast, learn faster, and embracing that across the organization to say this is what we want to do, it has the effect of increasing to a measurable degree, the aggressiveness that one pursues risk. And that's to your point about risk appetite. Are you overly conservative? Are you overly risk aggressive? Is there a trade-off? Is it depending on the objective or the risk? Probably yes to all those. But identifying where you are, and it's a visceral reaction, but you only know where you are by experiencing these different hypotheticals in a real-world risk-free environment, and then you kind of come together and say, all right, if we start to see this happening, and then this happens, and then that happens, we have a reasonable idea to expect that these finite number of effects are going to be next. And you have thought through it ahead of time, you look at each other in the eye and say, okay, let's make this decision. And so again, you go from that signal advantage to decisive move advantage to build that resilience advantage. So hopefully that helps explain it, Christian.
Well, thank you, Elton, for your unique perspectives. It was a great privilege having you on the channel. I'm Christian Schuh, and this has been a new segment of my channel, Procurement in the Park. Thank you for watching. And if you're a first-time visitor, please hit the bell and subscribe. Bye.